starting with the last one you mentioned about youth. Here at the Climate Law Accelerator, we have a youth fellowship. And one of our fellows spoke in the panel on Thursday, Aisha Siddiqa. Some of you may have attended her presentation, her reading of poetry. And one of the things that we've seen, not just with Aisha, but with other young leaders, is that not only are they made responsible for the solutions, but they're made into celebrities. So the human rights world kind of has been communicated to other audiences, to the general public, as a matter of individuals. As you may remember, that Aisha had a point about that, precisely about that, about her losing her voice because she was supposed to perform in a certain way for the media, to look a certain way, to speak in a certain way. So I wanted to open the panel asking Siva and Philip to go deeper into the role of young people and intergenerational justice, also because now we have a set of master principles on future generations, right? So this is a welcome update to the human rights legal infrastructure. But on the other hand, it does raise a number of problems, both practical and conceptual, that I wanted to have you both comment on. I don't want to steer this conversation in any particular way. I have a lot to say about this. I work quite a bit on climate change issues and intergenerational justice, but I'll just leave it there and ask you both to comment on the role of young people, of intergenerational justice and future generations' rights as they pertain to this larger conversation on the future of human rights. Siva, you want to get started?
Yes, thank you, César, for inviting me to be on the panel as well, and Philip for that really rousing few minutes, which was, I think this sets the tone for the entire 4 days of our time here. With respect to young people, I have been thinking about this quite deeply, and these days I tend to feel quite tender when I see a young activist, and that's partly because of my own age. It's also partly about the moment in history and where we are, right? And I do feel that that sort of emotion that we feel for protecting, for making sure that we leave things in a reasonable way can be quite a powerful motivator. So I see the instrumentalization of youth really about us. It's not that they are the sites of action solely, but they're being instrumentalized so that we can then respond to what they're feeling. And therefore, let's make it possible for them to protest. Let's make it possible for them to speak up. I think that's really incredibly important. And I just want to say that one of the things with instrumentalizing the youth in this way is that we're then burdening them with the same structures and institutions that have failed us so badly. And I want to bring in an example of what's happening in the Transition Committee with the Loss and Damage Fund negotiations and the insistence that the World Bank be used when a lot of developing countries do not see the World Bank as a friendly entity. So there are things, meaningful things that we can do in order to give them the kind of agency, a different kind of agency, not agency in the way we understand it, but an agency in order to motivate us to do the right thing. So it's a bit of a mixed answer.
Thanks, Siva. Philip?
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on the Loss and Damage Fund, I think there is it's not just a huge risk, I think there's a very high likelihood that that will just turn into another instrument of northern hegemony, promoting certain values while pretending to be helping people in the South. I think the World Bank is utterly incapable of doing anything other than promoting the private sector. I think that's what it is entirely devoted to. And I think that entrusting loss and damage and other funds is simply a way of the United States, essentially, sorry to sound so simplistic, keeping control over the whole thing. And as long as that happens, there will be no deep root change in sight. In terms of so two comments very quickly. One is that when I think of my own children, let alone my grandchildren, two of whom will be arriving later this week to terrorize me. To play at my feet. We are bequeathing them the most horribly damaged set of goods imaginable. That's just a reality. The world is, the global environment is already going to hell in a handbasket. And what they will be, quote, enjoying when they are 20 or 50 is going to be radically inferior to what we've enjoyed. I think one of the questions is how we equip them to understand and to deal with these things. And I suspect that most of us, and I would probably plead guilty to this with my the two late teenage kids that I've got, that we haven't equipped them to be fully aware of the perils of climate change, because we've convinced ourselves that it's not fair to destroy their childhood with such horrible news. But I think that is an evasion on our part and is not serving to empower them. One final comment, but you know this much better than I do, César, and I haven't given it the thought that I should. But I'm interested by the challenge to the intergenerational approach, to the extent that it does risk pushing things down the road somewhere, that instead of looking at what the hell we should be doing right now, the focus is on future generations, which is inevitably somewhat distant, ethereal, and so on. And while I think we absolutely should understand ourselves vis-a-vis future generations, we shouldn't let that distract us from the fact that the real responsibility is with us right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that the former UN Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, John Knox, has a really smart, pragmatic formulation of this. They say, look, people in the future are the people who will suffer some of the worst effects of climate change are alive today. They just happen to be 5 or 10 or 15. So children's rights, young people's rights, are the rights of the future as well, because this is how close the climate crisis is, the climate emergency is. And of course, that has the beauty of having an existing legal infrastructure in both constitutional law and international human rights law, the protection of children's rights. So moving on to the topic, I'm going to pick up on two things that Philip framed or reframed beautifully, following up on the UN High Commissioner's comments. One is the issue of pragmatism, which is crucial, I think, in human rights circles. If there is one reason of unstated reason for misunderstanding inside the human rights movement, is different conceptions of the relative value of pragmatism versus vision, if that's how you put it. I would say also sometimes it is framed as pragmatism versus principles, right? And John Ruggie, who was the UN rapporteur on business and human rights, as many of you know, he had a whole book in which he defended his approach to the construction of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, saying that he, being the well-known and highly sophisticated international relations scholar that he was a principled pragmatist, right? And that the UN guidance principles were principled pragmatism at play, right? That unlike the NGOs, he cared about things actually working in practice. And in order for the UN guiding principles to work, you needed to have some buy-in, for instance, from some companies, and definitely the backing of states, because this is an interstate process. So I want to leave it there. I'm tempted to jump into the fray here, but that's not my role in this panel. I just want to, I can afford just to frame the question here. So could you both comment on that balance? The one thing that I'll say is that in a book that I edited in which Ruggie had a chapter, I pushed back and I said, well, what if you put the emphasis the other way around? Like, does it make any difference to speak of pragmatist principalism, right? Or is it just the same? So we'll go to Philip first, because he got us into this sort of trouble. So,
I mean, I'm not, I wouldn't want to suggest that identifying what is pragmatic as opposed to what is a sellout or an acceptance of the status quo, how that can be defined. I think there's always a risk, obviously, of someone saying, I'm not going to do anything, but I'm doing it for pragmatic reasons. So the principles are clearly, and the vision has to be there. If there's no vision, then the hell with the pragmatism. It's just, it is status quo.
I think the question that you're asking, I'm going to put it into Mr. Turk's words. I think when he spoke about the economics of human rights, it left me feeling cold. And then he spoke about solidarity, and I thought, surely they seem mutually exclusive, because insisting on more and more rights is really outsourcing your intrinsic internal motivations to the rules, because the rules will take care of your behavior. And I think this is quite important, because as we keep multiplying pragmatic ways of doing things, we are avoiding looking deeper into what really connects us. And I looked at the biblical origins of solidarity. I'm just going to read that. And it's a passage from John Paul II's writing on social concern. It says, solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of many. On the contrary, it is firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. Here, I also want to bring in a question that Professor Anne Orford, Professor of International Law, poses. She posed this in 2022 in a lecture she gave about putting the social question back on the table. And the way she framed the social question is how human life can escape the demands of the market. Now, you can be quite ambitious about this question, or you can have a minimalist version of it. You could say, who's going to feed the poor? And she asked that question. Or you could be more ambitious and say, how do we limit the capacity of the market to demand that everything be sacrificed to its logic? And therefore, I feel this juxtaposition between the economics of human rights and solidarity is really not helpful. They are two different ways of living. And I want to redefine what we mean by economics. There's a lot of people here who are working on care economics. We know of people who are working on bioregional economics. So I can live with the economics of human rights if it is a different kind of economics. I don't think these economics are working. So that's how I would see your question coming from his remarks.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Shiva. And then a couple of questions asked about another theme that I saw both in the speech and in Philip's comment, which is this contrast between hope and outrage, right? And actually, one of our keynote speakers, Catherine Sickin, in her book, has a beautiful metaphor about this, and she says that, well, you need outrage because you need fuel, right? You need something to fuel the fire of activism. But activists too often burn out because they only are running on fuel. And so at some point, you need hope, or you need a vision for the future, so that rage gets turned into some sort of sense of efficacy and a sense of being able to change things on the ground. So with that in mind, I would like to ask Shiva and Philip to comment on this, and a couple of the questions went in that direction. How do you see the balance or the relationship between hope and outrage, going deeper into the issue that Philip raised?
Wow. I think there is a place for outrage, and I was really glad to hear you say that, Philip. I think I'm going to go back to COVID here, because I think COVID actually presented a perfect example of a lot of things that we're talking about here. I feel there was never enough outrage about the fact that these vaccines were not made available to developing countries. Where was the outrage? We took booster dose after booster dose after booster dose when so many developing countries didn't have their first dose. There were cries and pleas to allow manufacture of these vaccines in developing countries. There was evidence presented that these manufacturing units existed, they could take it on, but it did not happen. What did we get instead? We got philanthropo-capitalism. We got COVAX, the donated doses of the vaccines, which was essentially a form of market segmentation. These donated vaccines still had to be paid for. They were paid for by the EU, they were paid for by the US, they were paid for by richer countries, and they basically managed the question. It was a controlled bloodletting so that the rest of us could have our vaccines, the third, fourth, fifth booster doses. We saw a lot of outreach. There's a clip where Cyril Ramaphosa says, we were made to feel like beggars asking for vaccines. So, but the outrage didn't go anywhere. There was a very well-formulated proposal at the WTO to suspend intellectual property rights. There were a lot of people working on it, showing why this works and this would be a good idea, but it did not happen. However, I think that outrage, all the work that happened at that time has had an impact. I feel like the conversation is turning ever so slightly. The draft pandemic treaty, which we're supposed to finish negotiating this by May 2024, I have no idea how that's going to happen. It does have time-bound waivers in the treaty, in the draft treaty. It's probably going to disappear between now and May. But hold on to those words, keep your eye on it, see where that goes, see who's talking about it. So I think outrage has different forms. Outrage can manifest in different ways. And I would not give up on outrage. I would ask, where is the location of my outrage? Why do I feel this way? What can I do about it?
I mean, I think Shiva's example is a fantastic one. I mean, in very simplistic terms, as I understand it, what really happened was that there was a significant move towards a solidaristic response, and there was actually one person who turned it all around, the great philanthropist, Bill Gates. He said, I'm not going to stump up all my money to the private sector initiative if you go down this road, because you destroy capitalism. He didn't use those terms, but that's what he was on about. And so even the most powerful NGOs that were involved felt that that was game over. It was finished. Yeah. There was no way forward. I think, just very briefly, outrage, of course, we need to locate in different places. So the outrage of the people in the Global South who were screwed over is less important because, of course, they're outraged. You know, if everyone in this room is given an ice cream and I'm singled out and not given one, I'm going to be outraged. But the outrage that matters is the outrage of the rest of you saying, why hasn't poor Philip been given an ice cream? And so the outrage that's relevant in your example is our outrage in the global north. Those of us who got the 35 booster shots, and outrage at our own governments that connived and conspired and ensured the outcome that Shiva described. That's where the outrage needs to be. It's not victim, self-pity or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's the outrage of those who have some agency still to say, you can't treat them like that. We can't treat them like that.
Yeah, if I may. So that's a really beautiful point, and I'm glad you said it, because my point was incomplete without that. But I also want to spend a minute here to present a story of hope, because we now have the unit Afrigen in South Africa, which is producing mRNA-based vaccines. It has produced an homegrown COVID vaccine. Now, this, in the absence of technology transfer, in the absence of not facilitating this, how did this unit come up? It came up because scientists got together and said, look, we can do this. We can try and figure this out from first principles. So I think the emotions are important, because I think it gives individuals agency. And I want to talk more and more about individuals and what we can do. And I think I want to turn away from structures and institutions, which is why emotions seem quite important.
Just want to ask a follow-up question on outrage, and because we've talked quite a bit, and there was a whole solution stream on technology, and there were a couple of sessions on misinformation and disinformation, right? So just like there is a political economy of human rights, there's a political economy and an economy of attention and information and disinformation. What one sees oftentimes happening in the human rights field is that because there are so many things that one can be outraged about, it's hard to channel that outrage in an efficacious way. And by the way, not have it be turned inside the human rights movement, so that against of human rights sectors of the human rights movement going being outraged against other sectors or people with other thematic and geographic concerns. So, and as we know, a traditional strategy of the anti-rights movement, and Steve Bannon famously said that the strategy should be to flood the zone with trash, with garbage. It was another word with shit. So flood the zone with garbage content, and people will be constantly outraged about everything, including false information. So where is the economy of outrage in a world where contents and false and true that can trigger outrage are almost endless? And this was before generative AI. Philip, can I go first?
No, I think that's Steve.
That's it. So I think, I was quite interested by Rikin Patel's presentation, but I was also quite aware that the trigger spiral that he spoke of, one was automatic, and there are whole economies based on it, the rage spiral. The other spiral, the mindfulness spiral, takes a huge amount of work, right? I mean, even if you want to wake up an hour earlier so you could get to the gym, that's bloody hard, right? So internal change is so difficult. I don't have a particular answer to this. I do know what I'd like to see. I think we should discourage the formation of these economies that are based on misuse of information. I think that needs to be targeted. I don't think we've seen that. When we think of information, we think it's benign, it's neutral, we allow it to play out. And therefore, any sort of constraint on information is seen as a bad thing. And I think there we can, on a state government level, make some changes. But I wonder if one of the best antidotes to this is to strengthen the individual, the other spiral, the happy, mindful spiral. I don't know, how might we do this? Maybe part of this is about finding your tribe, finding your people, collaborating, and continuing to work, and not being passive recipients of these economies of misinformation.
I mean, just very briefly, my response maybe is the same. It's not a binary, it's got to be both. I think what we're seeing in the age of misinformation is a total lack of regulation that we don't tolerate in any other sphere, but the techno-optimists have encouraged or compelled us to accept that this is an area that will not be regulated. I'm not saying it's easy, but if we were actually engaged rather than, as with the US Congress, totally dysfunctional and unengaged, we would be grasping towards forms of regulation that would hopefully at least give us a better chance against the disinformation that is happening. So, it's not going to be easy, but I don't think it's inevitable to say, oh my God, well, everyone's outraged about everything. What can we do?
Mm. Yeah, and in that techno-optimist manifesto that Mark Andreessen recently published, he said something along the lines when he defends the market and the profit motive as the reigning concern and the reigning driver of human behavior and societal organization. He says, well, the market and money do scale, but love doesn't scale. It's I won't say much about that, but it's the idea that solidarity cannot be scaled up to the level beyond maybe the family or maybe one society, let alone definitely not to the level of humanity or of the globe. I'm going to move on. I've tried to summarize some of the questions and cluster them together in the questions that I've asked, but there's one that I want to ask concretely in closing. One of the questions says, well, to the panelists, if you were to propose 2 to 3 concrete interventions in the international governance system that pertain to human rights, what would there be? But please don't say, and this is what the question says, please don't say, reform the Security Council, blah, blah, blah.
Abolish the Security Council might be a better solution, I think. Probably in all seriousness, but anyway. Again, just to continue my provocations, but I believe this deeply, I think one of the biggest obstacles over the past decade, and this will shock everyone, I hope, is the Sustainable Development Goals. I think the Sustainable Development Goals are a sham, a facade. I don't think they have led to any form of deep change. They haven't led to the mobilization of any significant additional resources. They've taken inequality effectively off the table because the provisions are pathetic. And yet, the whole world of finance and of governments and others are totally focused on the Sustainable Development Goals. And so the answer that they would give to any challenge that you have is take the SDGs more seriously. And I think that's just it's a dead end.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one. Siva?
It's the first time I've ever silenced César, I think.
I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to take a specific example of sort of a sustainable development goal kind of ambition. So in the Oceans Treaty as well, and in a lot of other places, when we talk about capacity building, there is a tendency to think of it as a panacea for everything. Capacity building. We need legal capacity building. We need technical capacity building. We need capacity building, capacity building, capacity building. And sometimes it feels as if it's capacity building so that we can go and tell them why they need to agree with us. So if we only train them enough, they will see our point of view. So I totally agree that the Sustainable Development Goal language, because it's a goal, you don't have to reach this goal, right? You can just progress towards the goals, and you can define your own progress towards these goals and what that looks like. So I agree. I think the languages, the tools And I think Walker Turk also mentioned that we need to look for new tools. If I had one thing that I would do, I don't have a replacement for it, it would be to abolish COPs, these massive jamborees where people get together, spend a lot of money, they fly all over the world, and what happens? How many of us are going to be at COP28, hosted by Saudi Arabia? And is it COP now? I've lost track. I think the sort of conferencization of global progress is a dead end. I don't see where it's going. It just keeps us busy. It looks like we're doing something. Meanwhile, everything else is falling apart. I don't have a solution.
I would definitely second that on COP, but do keep coming to this conference. Don't ban all conferences, keep
No.
Forge. So
Keep in mind, Ford's 28.
Forge 28, exactly. Forge 28, not in Dubai.
No.
So with that, thank you so much, Philip and Shiva, for this
Thank
wonderful
you.
conversation. I think you will agree with me that although it would have been great to have Volker Turk here, that this panel was no less interesting. So thank both of you.
Thank you.